The night was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes the air feel heavier, thick with anticipation. A lone figure moved through the dimly lit corridor, his steps barely making a sound against the cold, hard floor. Shadows stretched long across the walls, flickering with the dying glow of a lantern hanging from the ceiling. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him, a presence lingering just beyond the edge of his senses. His heartbeat quickened, but his expression remained composed. He had been through worse, or at least that's what he told himself. As he reached the end of the hallway, the ancient wooden door loomed before him, its surface scarred with time. He hesitated for the briefest of moments, his fingers hovering over the rusted handle. It was just a door, he reminded himself, but his instincts screamed otherwise. With a deep breath, he pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of old paper and something faintly metallic. The room was filled with towering bookshelves, their contents undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. Dust motes swirled in the air as he stepped inside, his presence disturbing the stillness. At the center of the room, an old desk stood, covered in papers and artifacts, each one a piece of a puzzle he had been chasing for too long. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the aged parchment lying on top, its edges frayed and fragile. The symbols scrawled across it were unfamiliar, yet strangely recognizable, as if buried somewhere deep in his memory. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, though no window was open. The candlelight flickered violently, casting shifting shadows that seemed almost alive. He tensed, his senses sharpening. He was not alone. A whisper echoed from the far end of the room, soft, almost unintelligible, but there. He turned swiftly, scanning the darkness beyond the bookshelves. His pulse hammered in his ears as he took a cautious step forward. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. Silence. Then a single book slid off a shelf, landing with a muted thud on the floor. He swallowed hard, his fingers inching toward the small blade hidden beneath his coat. It could have been the wind. It should have been the wind. But deep down, he knew better. The whisper came again, clearer this time. A name, his name. A chill crawled down his spine. He had heard stories, warnings, but he had never truly believed them. Not until now. The room seemed to close in around him, the very air pressing against his skin. He turned back to the desk, his gaze locking onto the parchment once more. Whatever he had been searching for, whatever secrets lay hidden in these words, he was no longer sure he wanted to know. But it was too late to turn back. The weight of the moment settled upon him like a suffocating fog, pressing against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He had spent years chasing the unknown, unraveling mysteries buried beneath layers of time and deception. But this was different. This was real. The whisper that had called his name still echoed in his mind, an eerie reverberation that refused to fade. He stepped closer to the book that had fallen, its leather cover cracked with age. The title had long since worn away, leaving only the ghost of letters once imprinted upon it. Slowly he crouched down, his fingers brushing against the cover. A shock of cold shot through his fingertips, like touching ice in the heart of winter. He withdrew his hand instinctively, his breath hitching in his throat. The room remained deathly silent, save for the soft flickering of the candle on the desk. He knew he should leave. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn around and walk away. But he couldn't. Something held him there, an unseen force urging him forward. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out again, flipping open the cover. The pages inside were brittle, yellowed with age, yet the ink was still sharp, as if freshly written. Strange symbols filled the first page, twisting and curling in patterns that defied logic. He had seen similar markings before, in fragments of ancient texts, but never this complete, never this alive. The symbols seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if aware of his presence. A chill ran through him, but he refused to look away. He traced a finger over the first line, the ink cool beneath his touch. As soon as his skin met the parchment, a shudder ran through the air, a ripple of unseen energy that sent the candlelight quivering. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Then a sound, a deep, low creak, came from behind him. He spun around, his breath catching. The bookshelves stood undisturbed, their ancient tomes resting as they had for centuries. The air was still, but something felt off. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows that pooled in the corners, darker than they should have been. The whisper came again, closer this time, his name, spoken in a voice that didn't belong to this world. He took a slow step backward, his pulse hammering in his throat. His fingers tightened around the edge of the book as if it were an anchor keeping him grounded. But the moment he did, the pages began to turn on their own, flipping faster and faster until they stopped abruptly on a single passage. His breath caught. The words, written in ink as dark as midnight, spelled out something impossible. "We have been waiting for you." A chill crawled up his spine, every hair on his body standing on end. His mind raced through every logical explanation, but none could account for what was happening. The ink seemed to shimmer, as if alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a gentle shift in pressure, like the moment before a storm. But then, the candle's flame stretched unnaturally, elongating into something almost serpentine. The shadows around him thickened, stretching towards him like grasping hands. He staggered back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The book slipped from his grasp, landing with a heavy thud on the desk. The moment it did, the whispering voices rose, a chorus of murmurs speaking in a language he couldn't understand. They wove around him, pressing against his skull, seeping into his thoughts. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. Silence fell once more, heavier than before. The air was thick with an unspoken presence, something unseen but undeniably there. He clenched his fists, his mind screaming at him to leave. But just as he turned toward the door, a shadow shifted in the far corner of the room. Not just a trick of the candlelight. Something was there, watching. He couldn't move, his muscles locked in place, his breath frozen in his lungs. The figure stood impossibly still, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. But he could feel its gaze, a weight pressing against his soul. Then it moved. Not in a way that was natural, not in a way any human should move. It glided forward, silent, its presence more felt than seen. The air grew colder with each step it took, the dim candlelight barely illuminating the outline of something not entirely of this world. He swallowed hard, forcing his body to move. He took a step back, then another, his mind racing through every possible escape. But the moment he did, the whisper came again, closer than before. "You cannot leave." His blood turned to ice. The figure stopped just at the edge of the candle's glow. He could see it more clearly now, a humanoid shape, but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It had no eyes, no discernible features, yet he could feel its gaze piercing into him. His fingers twitched toward the knife hidden beneath his coat, but deep down, he knew it would be useless. This thing, whatever it was not bound by the rules of the world he understood. A slow, deliberate breath filled the silence, though the figure's chest did not move. Then it spoke. "Your time has come." The voice was not singular. It was layered, as if 1,000 voices whispered in unison, their words echoing through his skull. His heart pounded against his ribs, his mind screaming at him to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there frozen. But before he could react, the figure raised a hand, long skeletal fingers stretching toward him. The air around him constricted, pressing against his chest like an invisible force. His vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in. He tried to move, to breathe, but his body refused to obey. A sound, a distant, echoing chime, rang through the air. The pressure lifted. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His vision swam, but the figure was gone. The candle still flickered, the shadows still clung to the walls. But the oppressive presence had vanished. For a long moment, he remained there, his body trembling with the aftermath of whatever had just happened. His fingers dug into the floor, grounding himself in the reality that he was still alive. But he knew this wasn't over. The book still lay open on the desk, the ink shifting on the page as if waiting for him to make a choice. He forced himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run as far from this place as possible. But another part of him, the part that had brought him here in the first place, whispered something else. This was only the beginning, and deep down, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not yet. He stood in the dimly lit room, his breath still uneven, his pulse a relentless drumbeat in his ears. The weight of what had just happened pressed against his chest, an invisible force he couldn't shake. His gaze drifted back to the book on the desk, the ink shifting in a way that made his stomach twist. He should leave. He knew he should. But something held him in place, something stronger than fear. The room felt different now. The air was thick, charged with something unseen, something ancient. The candle's flame still flickered, but its light barely reached the far corners of the room. The shadows lingered, watching. A slow breath passed through his lips as he reached for the book again. His fingers hesitated just above the pages, the memory of that cold, unnatural sensation still fresh in his mind. But he had come too far to stop now. As his fingertips brushed the surface of the parchment, the ink shifted once more. This time, the words rearranged themselves, forming a new sentence. "You have seen us. Now, we see you." His breath caught in his throat. The ink pulsed, dark as midnight, as if alive. A chill slithered down his spine, the hairs on his arms standing on end. The words vanished. Then the whisper came again. Not just one voice, many, a chorus of murmurs, slipping through the walls, seeping into his thoughts. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, yet somehow their meaning curled in his mind like smoke. They were waiting. The candle's flame flickered violently, stretching unnaturally before snuffing out entirely. Darkness swallowed the room. His pulse hammered as his fingers tightened into fists. He strained to listen, but the silence pressed down on him like a physical weight. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond the walls. He wasn't alone. The realization sent ice through his veins. His breath came in shallow, measured inhales, his senses sharpening. The footsteps grew closer, soft, yet impossible to ignore. The walls of the old study seemed to tremble with each step. Then a single knock, sharp, hollow, right behind him. He turned swiftly, his heart lurching, but there was nothing, just the bookshelf, towering and still. Silence again, then another knock, not from behind him this time, from the door, the only door. He swallowed, his throat tight. He hadn't heard it open. He hadn't heard anyone enter. The knock came again. He took a step forward, his boots barely making a sound against the aged wooden floor. His hand hovered just above the door handle, his pulse a relentless thunder in his ears. "Who's there?" His voice was steady, but the air around him was anything but. No answer, just silence. And then, the door creaked open. His breath hitched. A sliver of darkness stretched from the hallway beyond, deeper than it should have been, like a void reaching toward him. The candle should have cast some light, even in its final embers, but it didn't. Something was out there, waiting. His grip tightened around the edge of the door as he pulled it open just a little more. The hallway stretched ahead, longer than he remembered. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and unnatural. And in the distance, just barely visible, a figure, standing perfectly still. It had no face, no features, just a humanoid shape carved from darkness itself. It did not move. It did not breathe, but he could feel its gaze. Then it took a step forward. A sound, low and guttural, rumbled through the hallway. Not quite a growl, not quite a whisper, but something in between. Something wrong. His instinct screamed at him to slam the door shut, to run, to get as far from this place as possible. But his body refused to obey. The figure took another step, then another. Its movements were deliberate, slow, each footfall echoing unnaturally through the corridor. The air grew colder with every inch it closed between them. He forced himself to move, retreating a step back into the study. The book on the desk shifted again, its pages flipping on their own. The ink bled across the parchment, forming new words. "Do not let it in." His breath came in short gasps as he shot a glance at the open doorway. The figure was closer now, the darkness around it swallowing the edges of the hall. And then it stopped. A single breath passed through the room, heavy, pressing. The shadows curled around the figure's shape, shifting, moving as if alive. And then the door slammed shut on its own. A sharp, deafening bang echoed through the study. He stumbled back, his chest rising and falling in rapid succession. The air around him pulsed, as if the very walls were breathing. Then silence. No footsteps, no whispers, just the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his skull. The book's ink shifted once more. Not yet. His fingers clenched at his sides. His mind fought for reason, for logic, but nothing about this was logical. This was something else, something ancient. His gaze lingered on the book. It knew. It had always known. His hands trembled as he reached for it again. The moment his fingers touched the parchment, the temperature in the room dropped even further. A breath of icy air slithered across his skin, and then the candle reignited. But the flame was blue. It flickered unnaturally, casting long, stretching shadows across the walls. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. Then a single word appeared on the page. Run. A chill crawled up his spine. Then the knocking returned. But this time, it wasn't at the door. It was inside the room. It was always the silence that arrived first. Long before the teachings, before the chants, even before the breath settled into its sacred rhythm, there was silence. The kind that doesn't just surround you, but enters you. It moves through your ribs like a tide, presses against the walls of your chest, and reminds you of something you forgot you were missing. That's how it began for him. Not with an idea, not with a calling, but with the weight of silence pressing gently into his life, asking him to pause. He had lived for so long with noise, not just the noise of the world, phones ringing, notifications pinging, traffic humming outside his window, but the deeper noise, the noise of trying to become someone, trying to do enough, to be enough, to convince the world and himself that he had value, that he mattered, that he was complete. But that kind of noise doesn't leave you peacefully. It resists, it fights, it convinces you that if you stop moving, you'll fall behind. If you stop proving, you'll be forgotten. If you stop giving, you'll no longer be loved. And so for many years, he didn't stop. He gave, he worked, he climbed, he excelled. But something quiet was unraveling inside him, thread by thread, until the day he could no longer ignore the ache. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. There was no moment of public defeat, no breakdown on the floor of his apartment. It was subtler than that. He just stopped feeling anything. Joy became a distant memory. Connection felt like a script he had memorized but no longer believed in. And beneath it all was the heavy, suffocating sense that he had lost something essential. Not his success, not his relationships, but himself. So he did the one thing his mind had told him for years he couldn't afford to do. He stepped away from the noise, from the ambition, from the endless chase. He packed a small bag, turned off his phone, and followed a thread of longing that led him far from the world he had built, into the arms of stillness. The retreat was tucked away in the hills, surrounded by tall trees and slow air. Everything moved with the rhythm of breath. The mornings began before the sun, not with alarms, but with the sound of bells, soft, round notes that called the body into presence. He arrived without knowing what he needed, but something in him already understood that what he had been searching for outside was waiting to be uncovered within. His first days were filled with discomfort, not because of the silence, but because of what the silence revealed. In the absence of distraction, everything rose to the surface. Regret, fear, guilt, old stories, old wounds. He wanted to run, to fill the space, but there was nowhere to go. No devices, no tasks, no titles to wear like armor, just his breath, his body, his mind. And slowly, moment by moment, he began to face himself. The teachers didn't offer answers. They didn't promise peace. They simply held space. They bowed more than they spoke. They listened more than they instructed. And in their quiet presence, he began to feel safe enough to let his own walls soften. He would sit in the meditation hall each morning, spine tall but not rigid, legs folded beneath him, and simply breathe. Sometimes his mind screamed. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it fell into a silence so deep it frightened him. But he stayed, and in staying he learned. He learned that the mind is not the enemy. It is a child, curious, fearful, hungry for safety. And like any child, it does not need to be silenced. It needs to be loved. He learned that emotions are not obstacles. They are messengers. They come not to punish, but to teach, to reveal the places within us that long to be seen. And most of all, he learned that healing is not a destination. It is a rhythm, a returning, again and again, to this moment, this breath, this body. In the afternoons, he would walk the forest path behind the temple. The trail curved through moss-covered stones and tall trees whose branches held the sky like prayer. He moved slowly, matching his pace to the rhythm of his breath. Sometimes he stopped just to place his hand on the trunk of a tree, to feel the pulse of life moving through it, steady and unbothered. Nature didn't rush. It didn't strive. It simply was. And in its presence, he felt something soften inside him. He began to write again, not to publish, not to impress, but to remember. Small notes scribbled into a notebook with no lines. Let go. Be here. Nothing to prove. The pages became mirrors, reminders, invitations. One evening, he sat beneath the Bodhi tree in the center of the garden, watching the sky change colors. He thought of all the things he used to believe were essential: status, approval, certainty. And now they felt so distant, so hollow. He no longer needed to be understood. He only needed to be whole. As the light faded, he closed his eyes and whispered softly, "I'm here," not to anyone else, but to himself. The last morning arrived like every other, with soft light filtering through misty hills, the familiar chorus of birds, the calm presence of a world that never needed to rush. But something inside him was different now. He stood by the window, looking out at the path winding toward the woods, and felt it not as something separate from him, but as something within. Every tree, every sound, every breath had become part of him. And this morning, instead of trying to hold on to it, he simply bowed to it. Packing took only a few minutes. He didn't bring much, and he would be leaving lighter than he came, not in weight, but in burden. What he carried now wasn't the ache of not being enough. It wasn't the noise of needing to prove himself. It wasn't the heavy layers of who he thought he was supposed to be. What he carried now was presence, and presence doesn't weigh anything. It simply rests in the breath, in the spine, in the open palms of one who no longer needs to grip anything. He walked to the main hall where others were gathering for the closing circle. No one wore the usual retreat expressions of withdrawal or performance. They had softened together, through silence, through shared stillness, through invisible threads of presence that didn't need to be explained. Some sat close, some at the edges. But all hearts seemed to beat in a rhythm of quiet reverence. The teacher entered and sat at the center of the circle, cross-legged, hands resting in his lap. He didn't speak for several minutes, just looked around, meeting each person's eyes as if memorizing the truth of who they had become. Then in a voice that barely needed volume, he said, "You've returned to yourselves. That's all awakening is, a remembering, a reunion." He paused, then added, "You will forget, and you will remember again." This rhythm is not failure. It is practice. It is life. There were no tears, only deep breaths, grateful ones. Some faces glowed with quiet joy, others with a softness that comes only after something hard has been laid down. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to be seen. He just needed to be present, and he was. When the circle dissolved, he walked the grounds one last time. The trail behind the temple, the stream that had carried his reflections, the bench beneath the fig tree. Each place held echoes of him now. The man who first sat in silence with a storm inside. The man who wept beneath moonlight. The man who forgave a father he didn't fully understand. The man who bowed not to tradition, but to truth. And then, without ceremony, he picked up his small bag and walked to the gate. The teacher was there waiting, as if the moment had always been planned. They didn't hug, they didn't say goodbye. The teacher simply placed his palms together, bowed his head and said, "Carry it gently." He bowed in return. No need for words. The walk back to the village was quiet. The world looked the same, but it no longer felt like a threat. The noise that used to stir anxiety now felt distant. The people he passed didn't seem to be rushing. They seemed lost, as he once had been. But instead of pity, he felt compassion, deep-rooted compassion. He no longer needed them to change in order for him to feel peaceful. He simply wished them stillness, and maybe one day they would find it. Back in the city, things resumed. The streets buzzed with urgency, phones rang again. Faces returned to hurried expressions, but he didn't rush to join them. He moved slower now, deliberate, present. He didn't feel separate from life. He felt anchored in it. When he returned to his apartment, it felt unfamiliar. The books, the framed photos, the way the furniture had been arranged with a version of himself he no longer needed to be. He didn't rearrange it immediately. He just sat, on the floor, among his own things, breathing. Eventually, he made tea, sat by the window, watched the clouds drift above the skyline. And in that moment, he felt no longing, no ache, no urgency. Just a calm awareness that life would continue, but he would no longer meet it from a place of absence. He was here now, fully. The days began to unfold not in sharp turns, but in waves. He worked when it was time to work. He rested when his body asked for rest. He paused to watch sunsets. He listened without waiting to speak. He laughed from his belly. He cried without needing a reason. Life was no longer something to master. It was something to befriend. One evening, he visited a park and sat beneath a tree with his journal, the same one he had filled at the retreat. He flipped through the pages, notes, prayers, whispers to his own soul. And then, on a new page, he wrote, "I am not here to perform peace. I am here to live it." He closed the book, smiled. The wind moved through the leaves above him like a song he now knew by heart. A child ran past him, laughing. A dog barked joyfully behind. An old couple held hands as they walked slowly along the path. He watched them all with the quiet wonder of someone who finally knew. This is it. This ordinary, sacred life. This is the moment, and I am home in it. No longer searching, no longer hiding, just breathing, just being. The silence stretched endlessly, thick and suffocating, pressing against his eardrums like the weight of an ocean. He tried to breathe, to move, but the darkness was absolute, wrapping around him like a shroud. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs, each frantic thump echoing in the void. There was no light, no air, no direction, just the unbearable stillness of something waiting, watching. Then a sound, soft, distant, barely more than a whisper. A voice. His breath hitched, his pulse stumbling. The voice didn't belong to him, yet it resonated inside his skull, as if it had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of his thoughts. "Do you remember now?" His mouth was dry. He tried to speak, but his throat refused to form words. He didn't understand the question. He didn't want to understand it. The darkness pulsed, shifting around him. Something was moving in the void, unseen yet present. He could feel it circling, threading through the empty space like fingers brushing against his skin. Cold, deliberate, familiar. Number that was impossible. Another whisper, this time closer. "You opened the book." His stomach lurched. The book, the ink, the pages that had known his name before he had spoken it. The memory crashed over him in a tidal wave, drowning him in flashes of things he hadn't realized he had forgotten. The words had written themselves into him, twisting through his mind, binding him to something beyond understanding, and now he was here, wherever here was. The presence in the darkness moved again, shifting at the edge of his awareness. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if that would make a difference, as if he could pretend this wasn't happening. A chuckle, low, dry, devoid of warmth. "You still think you can fight this?" His hands curled into fists. He didn't know who he was speaking to. He wasn't even sure if he was still himself. The darkness had no walls, no boundaries, stretching endlessly in every direction. He was weightless, lost, and yet the sensation of being trapped was suffocating. "You came back," the voice murmured, softer now. "You always do." A shudder ran down his spine. That wasn't true. It couldn't be true. The whisper curled around him like a serpent. "You don't remember, but I do." Something brushed against his arm. His breath hitched, every nerve in his body screaming. He jerked away instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. "I know why you keep returning," the voice continued, almost gentle. "But do you?" A cold, sharp pressure touched the back of his neck. Light, barely there. His entire body locked up. The presence wasn't circling him anymore. It was right behind him. He didn't turn. He couldn't. The whisper came again, so close that he could feel the breath against his skin. "Look." He didn't want to. He did, and the darkness shattered. Light exploded around him, blinding, searing through the endless void like a crack in reality itself. He flinched, the sudden shift overwhelming, and for a moment he thought he was falling. Then, the world slammed back into place. He was standing. The weight of gravity returned to his limbs, the feeling of solid ground beneath his feet unfamiliar, disorienting. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, ink, and something else, something metallic. He swallowed hard, his pulse still hammering. His eyes adjusted slowly. Shelves stretched high above him, filled with books that looked older than time itself. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the dim glow of candlelight. It was a library, or at least it had once been. But it wasn't empty. A figure stood among the shelves, half shrouded in shadow. Watching, his breath caught. He knew that silhouette. The figure stepped forward, and the flickering candlelight revealed a face, his own. A sickening wave of dizziness crashed over him. Number that wasn't possible. The other him smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "Ah, there you are." His throat closed up. He took a step back, his pulse pounding. The other him mirrored the movement perfectly. He turned his head slightly. So did the figure. His skin prickled. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there frozen, but his body refused to move. The other him tilted his head, studying him with something that wasn't quite amusement. He swallowed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Who? What?" "You already know," the other him said simply. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, more shadows shifting, stretching. He wasn't alone. The bookshelves groaned, as if something was pressing against them, moving within them. The candlelight flickered violently, struggling to hold its place against the encroaching dark. The other him took another step forward. "You left the story unfinished." The words sent an icy shock through his veins. The book. He had been reading. No, he had been inside the book. The words had swallowed him whole. He tried to step back again, but his body remained rooted in place. The air was thick, charged with something ancient and unrelenting. "You have to finish it," the other him said, voice steady, "or it will finish you." A whisper curled through the air, threading through the space between them like smoke. "You should listen to him," it murmured. His blood turned to ice. That voice. He knew that voice. The shadows shifted again, and the presence from the void returned, unseen but crushingly real. It had never left. "You came back," the whisper continued, amusement laced beneath the words. "But you never leave, do you?" The other him smiled. And then the candlelight died, and in that whisper, something shifted. It wasn't enlightenment, it wasn't bliss, but it was real. A small, quiet knowing that he didn't have to keep searching, that he didn't have to become anything other than what he already was. He opened his eyes, looked up at the night sky, and let himself breathe, deeply, freely. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to be anywhere else. He was home. Of all the things that could have happened, he hadn't expected this. The knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, resonated from within the very walls of the room. He forced himself to stay still, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts as the sound wrapped around him like unseen fingers, tracing the contours of his fear. The candle's eerie blue flame flickered violently, elongating the shadows in ways that defied logic. He swallowed hard, eyes darting to every corner, searching for something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But deep inside, he knew there was no explanation. This was no trick of the mind, no fragment of exhaustion warping his senses. Something was here, something that had been waiting. The book on the desk trembled slightly, its pages fluttering as if caught in a non-existent breeze. His fingers curled, nails pressing into his palm, grounding himself in the reality that was quickly slipping through his grasp. He needed to leave, but his legs felt rooted in place, the air around him thick, pressing against his chest, making every breath a battle. The knocking ceased, leaving a silence more deafening than the sound itself. And then, just as he thought he might have imagined it, a slow creak came from the far corner of the room. His gaze snapped toward it, and for a moment his mind refused to process what he was seeing. The bookshelf, massive, sturdy, unmoving for years, was shifting. Not all at once, but gradually, inch by inch, as if something behind it was pushing. The wood groaned in protest, the weight of knowledge and time resisting whatever force was at play. He stepped back, each movement calculated, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, ready to flee. But where would he go? The door was behind him, the hallway beyond it no longer feeling like an escape, but a pathway to something worse. He glanced at the book again, heart hammering. It knew more than he did. It had warned him. And yet, he was still here. A sharp snap echoed through the room as one of the bookshelf's sections jerked forward, leaving a jagged crack running along its side. His breath hitched. There was something behind it. He could feel it. A presence. Watching. Waiting. The air turned icy, frost creeping along the edges of the wooden surface. Tiny crystals forming where warmth should have remained. Then another jolt, and the entire shelf shifted outward. Not enough to reveal what lay beyond, but enough to make him realize he was not meant to see. But the problem with curiosity, with fear, with the human condition itself, was that once you knew something was there, once you knew that something was lurking just out of sight, you couldn't look away. He took a step closer, the floor beneath him groaning in protest. His pulse roared in his ears, a relentless drumbeat that almost drowned out the silence. Almost. The gap between the bookshelf and the wall was small, barely enough for a hand to fit through. But from within that narrow darkness, something moved. A whisper, soft, almost gentle, curled into his ears, a language he didn't recognize, but one his soul seemed to understand. It wasn't calling him. It wasn't inviting him closer. It was warning him. His breath trembled as he reached forward, fingers brushing against the wood. It was freezing, the cold biting into his skin like tiny needles. Another whisper, this one clearer. It sent a shiver through him, not just from the sound, but from the way it felt as though it had come from inside his own head. Do not look. His fingers jerked away. The air seemed to pulse, the candle's blue flame dancing wildly as if responding to an unseen force. And then, in a single, horrifying instant, the bookshelf moved completely. Not pushed, not pulled, but yanked into the darkness beyond, vanishing as though it had never been there at all. A gaping void replaced it, a pitch-black emptiness that defied logic. No wall, no backing, just a hollow space where nothing should exist. The cold deepened, seeping into his bones, and his breath curled in the air before him like smoke. He tried to step back, but the floor beneath him felt different now. Not solid, not safe. Like something beneath the wood was shifting, stirring, waiting. A sound rose from the void, low, guttural, ancient. It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a voice. It was something in between, something that resonated deep within his chest, vibrating against his ribs, making his vision blur. The shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting and curling as though alive. And then from within the darkness, a shape emerged. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he had ever seen before. It moved with an unsettling grace, limbs too long, body shifting as though it wasn't confined by the same rules of existence as he was. The air around it warped, bending inward, pulling at the room itself. He tried to breathe, but the weight of its presence pressed down on his lungs, squeezing, crushing. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The moment its gaze, if it even had eyes, fell upon him, he understood. It wasn't here by chance. It had been waiting, and he had called it. The realization settled in his chest like lead. He had read the words. He had touched the book. He had seen what was never meant to be seen. The creature took a step forward, its movement soundless, its form shifting in and out of focus, as if the very fabric of reality struggled to contain it. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee, to do anything but stand there frozen in place. But it was too late. The book trembled violently on the desk, its pages flipping in a frenzy, ink bleeding through the parchment. A single word burned itself into the surface, glowing with an eerie white light. "Leave!" His feet finally obeyed. He turned, his body moving before his mind could catch up, the door just a few feet away. But as his fingers reached for the handle, it twisted violently on its own, the wood splintering as the door flung open with a force that sent him stumbling backward. The hallway was no longer a hallway. It stretched, impossibly long, the walls lined with doors that hadn't been there before. Each one slightly open, revealing glimpses of things that defied comprehension. An endless staircase spiraling into darkness. A room where the walls pulsed like a living thing. A figure sitting perfectly still in a chair, its head slowly turning toward him. He tore his gaze away, focusing on the only thing that mattered: escape. But there was no escape. The air was heavier now, pressing down on him as the figure from the void stepped fully into the room. It was closer than before. Too close. He ran. His feet barely touched the ground as he sprinted down the unnatural corridor. The doors on either side whispering, calling, some slamming shut as he passed. The hallway twisted, stretching and shrinking, the perspective warping with each step. He wasn't getting anywhere. He was trapped. The sound of footsteps followed him. Not hurried, not rushed, just steady, relentless. The kind of footsteps that knew they would reach him eventually. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, but he kept moving. A light appeared in the distance, a single beacon in the madness. He pushed forward, every muscle in his body screaming for release. Just a little further, just a little more. The whispers grew louder. The doors shuddered violently, something behind them clawing, banging, trying to break free. And then, the ground disappeared beneath him. He fell. The world spun into darkness, the air rushing past him as if he had been swallowed whole. His mind barely had time to register the sensation before he hit something solid. The impact should have hurt. It should have shattered bones, stolen his breath. But instead, he landed with an unsettling weightlessness, as if reality itself had softened his fall. The darkness clung to him, wrapping around his limbs, slithering into his thoughts. And then, in the distance, a familiar sound, the fluttering of pages, the book. He wasn't free. He was exactly where it wanted him to be. The next morning came not as a surprise, but as a gentle arrival, like a friend slipping into the room without needing to knock. Light filtered through the rice paper windows, something ancient that stirred within him as he moved through each day with intention, not to accomplish, but to be. His mind, once loud with tasks and timelines, had quieted. Not completely, but enough. Enough to hear the subtler sounds of his spirit returning to itself. The others at the retreat became familiar, not through conversation, but through presence. A nod in the hallway, a shared smile after morning practice, a bowed head after evening meditation. They were fellow travelers, each walking a different path, but all guided by the same compass, toward truth, toward peace, toward something that couldn't be named, but could be felt. One afternoon, he sat beneath the large Bodhi tree at the center of the retreat grounds. Its trunk was wide and weathered, its roots like ancient arms anchoring it deep into the earth. He placed his hand on the bark and closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of leaves and soil. He had read stories of the Buddha sitting beneath such a tree, finding enlightenment not in the heavens, but in the roots of stillness. And now sitting here, he understood. Not intellectually, but viscerally. Stillness is not empty. It is full, full of everything we spend our lives trying to find outside of ourselves. As he sat, he remembered a moment from years ago, a morning when he had rushed through breakfast, scrolled through emails, answered calls, and driven to work without once noticing the sky. And now the memory made his chest ache, not with guilt, but with a quiet sadness for the parts of his life he had lived half asleep. He hadn't been careless. He had just been convinced he didn't have time. That rest was a luxury, that presence was a privilege. But now he knew better. Now he understood that presence is not something to earn. It is something to allow. It is the most natural state of being, the returning home we are all wired for, yet so often resist. The teacher's voice echoed in his memory. The world will not slow down for you, but you can slow down for the world. He opened his eyes and looked up at the sky visible through the tree branches. Blue, vast, indifferent, beautiful. A single leaf drifted down, swirling gently until it landed at his feet. He picked it up, examined its intricate veins, its delicate edges, the way it curled inward like a quiet gesture. It had let go without resistance. No struggle, no regret. And in its falling, it had found freedom. That evening during the Dharma talk, the teacher spoke of surrender. Surrender is not giving up, he said. It is giving in to this moment, to what is, without resistance, without trying to bend it to our will. The words stirred something in him. He had spent so much of his life trying to control outcomes, emotions, perceptions. He had worn masks to fit in, built walls to protect himself, set impossible standards to feel worthy. But surrender? That was something he had never allowed himself. It had always felt like weakness, like failure. But now he saw it for what it truly was: courage. The courage to stop fighting life, the courage to trust the current, to trust himself. That night he walked alone under the stars. The air was cool, the sky painted with constellations he had once memorized as a child. He remembered lying on the grass in his backyard, staring up in awe, wondering about the vastness of it all, wondering where he belonged in that cosmic dance. And now, decades later, he finally had an answer. Here. He belonged here, not in some distant future where everything was perfect, not in the image he had once tried to project, but here, in this breath, in this flawed, beautiful, ever-changing moment. He lay down on the earth, letting the ground hold his weight, letting gravity be enough. Above him, the stars continued their silent dance. He didn't need them to explain anything. He just needed to be near them, to feel small and significant all at once. The next morning, he rose before the sun and joined the group for walking meditation. They moved slowly, each step a prayer, a return, a declaration. I am here. I am here. I am here. The sound of feet on stone, the rhythm of shared breath, the quiet communion of presence. No one rushed, no one led. They simply walked, together, alone. He had learned that healing doesn't always look like light. Sometimes it looks like shadows, like tears falling silently during a sit, like the sudden memory of a moment you thought you had forgotten, like facing the ache you've spent years avoiding and still staying, still breathing. There were days when emotions rose like storms, grief, regret, longing, and the practice was not to escape them, but to welcome them, to say, yes, you too, you belong, you are part of me. He wrote often in his journal now, not to record, but to reveal. He wrote letters to his younger self, apologies, forgiveness, gratitude. He wrote to the people he had hurt, the people who had hurt him, not to send, but to set free. And in that writing,